Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
They acted like I wasn't even there, and the worst part was that I knew it was going to happen before I even walked through the door, because it always does, and yet I still went, thinking maybe this time they'd surprise me. Maybe this time someone would look at me and treat me like I mattered. But no, the evening played out just like every other gathering in this family, with Mark holding court in the center of the living room, his wife laughing too loudly at things that weren't funny, my parents hovering around them like proud hosts at a banquet while I, once again, slipped into the background and became useful in the only role they ever leave open for me, the quiet helper who clears the plates and refills the drinks and asks about everyone else's lives while no one bothers to ask about mine. I stood there, smiling at the right moments, nodding along when Mark told the story of how his boss complimented him at some work dinner, biting my tongue when my mother gushed about how lucky she was to have such a successful son, pretending it didn't sting when no one asked me about the big project I had just wrapped up at work, the one that had taken months of effort and late nights. It wasn't even about needing praise. I don't crave a spotlight, but when you keep showing up, time after time, and your very existence is brushed aside as if it's inconvenient or embarrassing, it wears you down in a way I can't fully describe. Like you're fading out of your own family's memory while standing right in front of them. When dinner was over and everyone else sat around finishing their wine and dessert, I was the one who started stacking plates, gathering forks and knives, and carrying everything into the kitchen without being asked, because I already knew no one else would move. My dad made a half-hearted comment about how I always keep things organized while still sitting comfortably in his chair, and that was the extent of the acknowledgement I got. I didn't bother to respond. I washed the dishes, wiped the counters, and packed away leftovers while laughter from the other room floated in, as if I weren't in the same house, as if I weren't part of the same bloodline. By the time I left, they were still talking about Mark's plans for the summer, debating what kind of car his wife wanted next, and my mom didn't even walk me to the door. I hugged her quickly, forced a polite smile, and told her good night while she half listened, still laughing at something my brother had said. Driving home, I told myself to stop caring, to accept that this was how it was going to be, that some families just pick favorites and the rest of us have to learn to deal with it. But of course that's easier to say in the car alone than it is to believe when you're right in the middle of it, invisible in plain sight. I went through the motions of getting ready for bed, brushing my teeth, scrolling on my phone, trying to distract myself with mindless nonsense until I was too tired to think. At some point, I must have dozed off, because when my phone lit up on the nightstand, it was 2 in the morning. The screen showed a message from Mark, which was unusual enough to jolt me fully awake, because he never texts me unless it's about logistics or some random favor he needs. My stomach dropped as I opened it, and all it said was, "What happened with Mom? She won't stop crying." I stared at it for a long time, trying to piece together what he meant, replaying the night in my head, scanning every word and every glance to figure out when something might have happened. Nothing made sense. My mom hadn't said anything to me, hadn't even looked upset when I left, and now here was Mark, at 2 in the morning, acting like I was the one who should know why she was in tears. That was when it hit me with a sick kind of clarity. Something was said about me, or maybe to me, and instead of addressing it while I was there, instead of having the decency to include me in the conversation, they had let it fester in whispers after I walked out the door. It wasn't confusion I felt in that moment, not really. It was recognition. The realization that even when I am present, even when I put in the effort, even when I play along and do everything right, they still manage to act like I'm not part of the family, except this time it had spilled into something bigger. Something that made my mom cry, and somehow I was the one being texted in the middle of the night like I had the answers. I typed out a dozen responses in my head, everything from sarcasm to anger, but I didn't send any of them. Instead, I set the phone down and just sat there, staring at the wall, because I finally understood that I wasn't crazy. They knew I was there, they just chose to treat me like I wasn't, and now, for reasons I didn't yet understand, it had backfired on them. And as much as it hurt, as much as it twisted my stomach to imagine my mom crying in her bedroom while my brother scrambled to figure out what to do, I couldn't shake the small, dark thought that maybe, just maybe, this time it wasn't going to be me carrying the weight of their choices. This time, the cracks were showing in their perfect little picture, and whether they wanted to admit it or not, I wasn't the one holding the hammer. I woke up with that heavy feeling that sits in your chest when you know something ugly happened in a room you just left, and even though I had Mark's message sitting there, blinking like a little alarm on my screen, I refused to jump the way I always do. Because I was tired of being the on-call firefighter for problems I didn't start, so I set the phone face down, made coffee I could barely taste, and told myself I would answer after I had my head straight enough to avoid giving them exactly what they wanted, which was me cleaning up the mess, while they got to keep their hands clean and their voices gentle and their consciences spotless. When I finally called my mom, I kept my voice even and kind the way a grown daughter does when she has been trained to soothe, and I asked if she was okay, and she gave me that familiar line that every woman with an emotional mother knows by heart. The one that pretends everything is fine while beating around the obvious, and she said she was just tired and a little overwhelmed and not to worry, and I said I would not, and I hung up knowing full well that this dance had steps I could do with my eyes closed, because the real conversation had clearly happened after I left, probably at the table while someone stacked the dessert plates and someone else topped off the wine. With my name parked in the middle like a bad headline no one wants to read out loud but secretly enjoys discussing, and you can call me sensitive if you want. But I have been living in this family long enough to recognize the sound of my reputation being sanded down in another room. I texted Mark, not with a paragraph or a plea, but with one long sentence that put the ball in his court without giving him anywhere to hide, and I wrote that I had seen his message in the middle of the night and that I was sorry Mom was upset. And that since I had not said or done anything to cause it while I was there, perhaps he could tell me what changed after I left, and then I put the phone down again because I wanted him to feel, for once, the same dead air he has handed me for years. That drawn-out pause where I am expected to fill the silence, to fix the tone, to explain the story I did not write. While I waited, I did something I should have done a long time ago, which was to pull up my notes and scroll through all the small transactions and favors and errands I had covered without thinking. The grocery runs and paper goods and the time I replaced their coffee maker because it broke on the morning of a holiday and no one wanted to deal with it, and the list was not about money as much as it was about a pattern. 100 small ways of being useful that never translated into being respected, and I made a simple tally written in plain words that even a defensive person could not spin, and then I wrote another list that mattered more, a straightforward rotation with names attached for setup and cleanup and dishes and leftovers. Because if I was invisible, they could damn well try doing what the invisible person had been doing all along. Then I called my sister-in-law under the softest pretext I could find, which was to ask if I had left my serving spoon, because asking for something specific makes people show their tells. And I listened to her answer with that bright cheerfulness she puts on like perfume when she is hiding something. And she said she had not seen it, and then immediately added that everyone had such a nice time, and that she hoped I did not take anything personally if conversation got a little lively, and I made a small sound that could mean anything and said I did not, and I thanked her, and I hung up with the certainty you only get when someone accidentally confirms what you suspected by over-explaining a thing you never asked, which told me that not only had there been talk, but that it had been framed as entertainment. So I opened the family group chat that morning and, without drama or sarcasm or a single sharp word, I wrote a long, polite message that said I loved seeing everyone and that I would be coming as a guest from now on because I realized I had been defaulting into the organizer role without meaning to. And to keep things fair, I attached a simple rotation with names and duties spelled out in full words, and I added a brief note at the end that said I had also listed the household items I have provided at recent gatherings so we could plan better going forward, and I hit send. And I put the phone face down again, and I breathed in a way I have not breathed in years, because that tiny act, as ordinary as it looks on the screen, was the first time I refused to let my usefulness be their excuse for pretending I did not exist. The responses came in exactly how you would imagine. My dad with a thumbs up I could practically hear, my mom with a soft, "You don't have to do this," that read like habit, my sister-in-law with a chirpy, "Oh, this is helpful," that tasted like air freshener. and nothing from Mark, which was interesting, because the one person who woke me at 2 in the morning to ask me to solve a mystery suddenly had nothing to say when I asked for clarity and daylight, and I let the silence sit there and do the work for me, since silence, when you are not the one rushing to fill it, can be a beautiful kind of pressure. My small revenge, if you can call it that, landed a few hours later when the group chat pinged with a message from my aunt asking if the rotation was really necessary, because some people are better at hosting. And I replied with one calm sentence that said hosting does not mean making one person do everything, and that I would be happy to bring dessert like any other guest. And I watched 3 typing bubbles appear and vanish, while the system quietly shifted in my favor. Because I had just taken away the one lever they thought they had over me, which was my willingness to earn a seat by working for it, and while it was not flashy or cruel, it was the first brick I pulled from the wall, and I could feel the structure start to wobble. Late in the afternoon, after hours of that strange family quiet where everyone is talking to everyone but no one is talking to you, my phone rang with my mom's name, and when I answered, she did not bother with small talk. She just asked in a very even voice who told me what my aunt said after I left, which I had not mentioned to her, and I let a beat pass long enough for her to hear it, and I said, just as evenly, that I was more interested in why it was said than in who carried it, and then I asked if she wanted me to come by tonight or if tomorrow would be better, and she took another breath and said tomorrow, and that single word told me that someone had already started scrambling behind the scenes, which meant my gentle little list had done exactly what I needed it to do, and as I hung up I felt that low, steady click of a plan sliding into place, because if they were going to make me invisible, I would turn transparency into their problem. And it was only a matter of time before the person who started the whisper had to say it to my face. By the time morning rolled into afternoon and the house had settled into that quiet that tells you the world is still doing what it always does whether you like it or not, I decided that if they were going to act like I was a rumor in my own family, then I would treat their whispers like a map, because maps can be followed and traps can be set, and I started with something simple that any sane person could defend later, which was to talk to each of them separately and drop one harmless, trackable detail, nothing cruel, nothing explosive, just a breadcrumb with a distinct flavor so that if it came back to me I would know exactly whose mouth had carried it. With my sister-in-law, I chose the sort of thing that sounds helpful in public and self-serving in private, telling her in an easy tone that I was thinking about stepping back from planning the holidays altogether because work had become intense, and my therapist, who she knows I see because she once turned it into a joke about self-care candles, suggested I try something radical called boundaries, and I watched her agree with me a little too quickly while her voice tilted into that upbeat register people use when they are filing away information for later, and I let it go and moved on, because the point was not to argue, the point was to cede. With my aunt I tried something even gentler that would only matter to people who like to keep score, and I told her that I was organizing a proper list of family heirlooms stored in my garage so nothing went missing over time, and that I was thinking about asking everyone to sign for items they borrowed, not because I distrusted anyone but because keeping track reduces confusion, and she made a sound that said she agreed while another sound under it said she did not, and I tucked that sound away because it is always the sound that tells you the truth. With my dad I did not set a trap so much as I turned on a light, telling him in a low voice that I no longer wanted to host anything until we agreed on a rotation, and that I meant it without resentment, and he said he understood, and that I should not worry. Yet he immediately asked me if I wanted him to talk to my mom first so it would not feel like an ambush, which reminded me that the men in my family often present themselves as buffers while they conveniently ignore that they are also amplifiers, and I told him I could handle it, because I could, even if I was shaking a little when I hung up. With Mark I picked something that would test his appetite for drama disguised as concern, and I said that after his late-night message I had been thinking about fairness, and that an accountant friend told me families do better when they stop calling personal outlays loans and just label them gifts so there is no resentment or ledgers later, and although I delivered it calmly, I watched the typing bubbles appear and vanish as if he were arguing with himself in a mirror, and then he sent one Mine thanking me for the tip with a winky tone he did not bother to mask, which told me he had heard the shot whistle past his ear even if it had not touched him yet. Then I did the most boring and therefore most powerful thing I could do, which was to write everything down the minute it happened, not in some secret file with dramatic headings, but in plain sentences with dates and times spelled out and words copied exactly as spoken. And I screenshotted what needed capturing, and I labeled it all with calm little tags so that when the inevitable, that is not what I said, arrived, which it always does in families that rely on fog to maintain control, I would have clarity enough to cut through the fog without raising my voice. The first breadcrumb came back faster than I expected, because within hours I received a call from a cousin who never calls me unless she wants a recipe or a ride. And she launched straight into a chatty monologue about how she totally supported my decision to focus on my mental health and skip holiday planning if that was what my therapist suggested, which was a sentence only one person in the family had heard from me that day, and while I kept my voice warm and thankful, my pen drew a line. From my sister-in-law to my cousin, like a teacher circling the wrong answer on a test, except I did not stop there, because one breadcrumb does not prove much and patterns are the only currency that hold up when the denials start flying. The second breadcrumb took the long route and came back wearing my aunt's perfume, because my mother called me before dinner in a voice that had been polished smooth by someone else's opinions and asked if I really intended to make people sign for heirlooms. And I listened to the way the question was framed as a warning rather than a curiosity, and I knew my aunt had not only repeated my words, but tilted them just enough to make me look petty, which is a familiar move in families where fairness is treated like an accusation. So I said, very calmly, that I only wanted to prevent misunderstandings and that anyone who was offended by accountability probably had a reason. And then I let the silence stretch until she changed the subject, because that silence was not mine to fix. The third breadcrumb, the one I did not anticipate, arrived through my dad of all people, a man I had always categorized as neutral bordering on absent, because he sent me a careful message asking if I could please not bring up the gift versus loan idea with my brother in front of Mom, since it might upset her to think that anyone was keeping score, which would have been sweet if it had been his original thought. But the phrasing told me it had already been chewed over with someone who wanted it contained, and given the timing and the cadence, I recognized the source with a jolt I felt in my teeth, because the echo in that sentence did not belong to my sister-in-law, it belonged to Mark. That was the moment something inside me clicked from observation to strategy, because I understood that while my sister-in-law was running the small errands of gossip, the architect of the narrative was my brother. The man who woke me at 2 in the morning to ask me to clean up tears he had very likely engineered, and my revenge for the day was not to blast him or corner him or start a fight, but to send one impeccably polite message in the family thread that said I appreciated everyone's feedback, that I would not be hosting or coordinating any upcoming events until we established, in writing, a shared plan everyone agreed to, and that any conversations about me would include me so nothing got lost or exaggerated. A sentence so calm and reasonable that no one could argue with it without outing themselves, and as the typing bubbles flared and retreated and phones lit up in houses I could picture without wanting to, I felt the balance tilt a measurable degree in my direction. Because I now knew exactly who had been moving the pieces behind the curtain, and it was not the person I had been blaming in my head, which meant tomorrow would not be about comfort or reconciliation, but about what happens when the narrator steps into her own story and asks the lead actor to explain his lines while everyone is listening. My mother called the next morning with a tone that tried to sound normal and landed somewhere between careful and rehearsed, and she suggested we do a small family dinner. Nothing complicated, everyone brings one thing, just a quick chance to reset. And I said I would come as a guest, that I would bring a store cake, and that I would arrive exactly on time rather than early, because I wanted the night to begin without me quietly turning into the staff again, and she hesitated for a second and then said that sounded fine, which told me that she had already had a conversation with someone who promised her they could keep everything smooth if I did not escalate, a word that always means tell the truth while people are forced to hear it. When I walked in, I handed my mother the dessert with a smile that said I was not angry and also not volunteering. And I put my purse down in a place that would not block any traffic because I did not want to give anyone an excuse to redirect the conversation to clutter. And I greeted my dad, who did his usual shoulder squeeze that means he wants peace without work. And my sister-in-law floated over with the bright voice she uses when she is running defense for my brother, and she said she was so glad I could make it, and I said I was glad to be here as a guest, and I did not move toward the kitchen or the stack of plates, which made my aunt glance at me and then look away, a small social twitch that said she had already decided I was being difficult, which I accepted as the price of being visible. I waited until everyone had poured drinks and settled into their usual places before I took out my phone and, with the same tone you would use to ask who wants decaf, said that before we get rolling I would love to put the shared note on the table so we can assign tonight's cleanup in the order we discussed, since fairness works best when it is not theoretical, and I said that according to the simple rotation, which I had posted days ago in the family thread, Mark and his wife were up for dishes while my aunt had counters and my dad had trash and recycling, and I let the words float there without apology because they were not an attack, they were housekeeping, and housekeeping is only threatening to people who are used to someone else doing it. Mark tried the laugh he uses when he wants to make me seem uptight, and he said that we did not need to make a whole process out of a casual dinner, and I said that was the beauty of a process, that it makes the casual part honest, and then, because I had not forgotten the message that had yanked me awake at 2 in the morning, I added in the most neutral tone I could manage that I would also appreciate if any conversation about me included me, since I learned the other night that things were said after I left and that Mom ended up crying, and I said I would rather avoid a repeat of that, particularly since Mark was concerned enough to text me about it, and then I stopped talking. Because sometimes the cleanest move is to put the fact on the table and watch who reaches for it. My mother's eyes flicked to my brother and stayed there long enough to matter, and my aunt shifted in her chair as if the cushion had betrayed her, and my sister-in-law started to speak and then thought better of it, and Mark, who prides himself on always having a quick answer, took a beat too long and finally said he had texted me because he was worried about Mom's stress level and wanted to make sure I had not said anything upsetting, which would have been comical if it were not so revealing. Because the words rearranged themselves in the air into the sentence he did not say, the one where I am the problem before any facts exist, and my mother, to her credit, asked in a steady voice what exactly had been said after I left that made her cry. And my aunt attempted to pivot to the roast as if it required immediate leadership, and I did not rescue her from the silence, because the silence was a better witness than I could ever be. Since no one wanted to volunteer the truth, I reached for something small and undeniable, not to humiliate anyone but to show that I was done pretending not to notice, and I said that while we were here I would love to grab my serving spoon if it turned up. The big one with the worn edge that I had asked about yesterday, and my sister-in-law, who had told me on the phone that she had not seen it, went still in a way that only I seemed to register, because the spoon was sitting in the dish right next to her, plain as anything, which would have been trivial in another family, but mattered here because small lies are the glue that holds the larger story together. So I walked over, lifted it out like a person retrieving her own keys, and said that this is exactly why sign-outs prevent confusion, and I set it in my purse without raising my voice, and the table absorbed the message that the days of treating me like a supply closet with legs were over. Then, before anyone could reframe the moment as a misunderstanding, I turned to Mark and said that since he was worried about Mom's feelings, I wanted to be sure we were aligned on not discussing my choices or contributions in rooms I am not in. Because if something I do upsets her, I should be present to hear it and fix it, and he started to argue that no one had discussed me and that I was reading too much into it, and I said I did not want to pull out my phone at the table, but that I would if we were rewriting history. Because I had the message he sent me at 2 in the morning, and I had the call from our cousin relaying words she could only have gotten from his house. And I watched the bravado drain out of his posture like air leaving a balloon you did not even know you were holding, and I felt the room recalibrate around the simplest truth of all, which is that I am not a ghost. My small revenge that night was not dramatic or cruel. It was simply refusing to lift a single plate after dinner while I sat beside my mother and asked her about the recipe she grew up with, and my dad carried a full trash bag past us, and my aunt wiped down the counters she once said were not really her thing, and my brother stood at the sink learning what soap feels like when you are used to applause, and when I finally hugged my mother goodbye, I told her in a low voice that I would stop by tomorrow because I wanted to talk without an audience, and she squeezed my hand like a woman who has been waiting to be given permission to step off a script. And as I walked to the door, my phone buzzed with a one-sentence message from Mark that said we needed to talk before I made this worse, which made me smile in a way I kept to myself, because tomorrow would not be about making it worse. Tomorrow would be about finishing what I started, and I already knew exactly where the final pressure point was and how hard to press. By the time I pulled into my mother's driveway the next afternoon, I already knew that the conversation waiting behind that front door was going to be the one that decided whether the old rules were going to continue dragging behind us like broken luggage, or whether someone, me, apparently, was finally going to drop them on the pavement and walk away lighter. Because the truth is that no matter how many group chats you update, or calendars you share, or polite boundaries you draw, none of it means anything until you look someone in the eye who used to talk over you and say, without blinking, I know what you did, and I am not afraid of the fallout anymore. My mom answered the door with that guarded warmth she uses when she's trying to hold two truths in the same room, the version of me that she thinks she raised, and the version of me that she has been politely resenting for not staying in the shape she built. And I stepped inside, kissed her cheek, and handed her a copy of the cookie recipe I promised, because some things don't need to be a battlefield, and then I followed her into the kitchen where everything smelled like comfort and memory and tension, and we sat across from each other at the little table she used to fold laundry on while giving me life advice I didn't ask for. She asked, eventually, in that cautious way of mothers who know they're about to hear something they won't like, but want credit for listening, why I've been acting so distant, and I said that distant isn't the word I'd use, but intentional might be closer. And she nodded as if bracing for impact, so I told her the plainest version of the truth I had, that I was tired of being erased in plain sight, tired of doing the work no one thanks me for, and then being talked about like a complication. When I stopped smiling through it, tired of being treated like the family utility instead of an actual person with a spine and a story and a limit, and she opened her mouth once to interrupt but didn't, which was the closest thing to progress I've seen from her in years. I reminded her, gently but without flinching, of how many times I had been the one washing dishes while everyone else laughed in the living room, of how often I had shown up with a homemade dessert only to have someone else's store-bought cake get praised because the packaging looked fancier, of how often my job, my friendships, my life outside of these walls were treated like minor footnotes compared to whatever Mark had said in his last meeting or what his wife had posted on social media, and I said that when she cried after I left the other night, it wasn't because I hurt her, it was because someone said something about me that made her realize she didn't know who I was anymore, and that realization wasn't mine to fix. She said, finally, in a very quiet voice, that Mark had told her I had been pulling away from the family for a while, that I had been keeping secrets and making things difficult, and I didn't yell or scoff or roll my eyes. I just handed her my phone and scrolled to the message he sent at 2 in the morning, the one that said she was crying and asked what happened, not what I had done, and I said, if I'm so distant, why am I the one he texts in the middle of the night to handle his messes? And she blinked a few times and looked at the floor like it had something to offer her, and then she asked if there was more I wanted to say, and that's when I knew she was finally, for once, actually ready to listen. I told her I was done accepting the version of the family where I was expected to absorb everyone's disappointment without ever showing any of my own, and that moving forward, I would attend what I wanted to, contribute only what I offered freely, and speak up the second I felt the air turn cold behind my back, and if that meant people had to adjust, then good, because I was done adjusting until I disappeared. She said she understood, and maybe she even meant it, but I wasn't waiting for that anymore. I had already moved on from needing her permission to take up space. Later that evening, Mark called, not texted, called, and when I answered, his voice had that brittle politeness people use when they're trying to make you feel like the aggressor for not making it easier on them. And he said he didn't appreciate being accused of things that weren't true, that I had taken everything out of context, that I was blowing things up that could have been handled quietly, and I let him go on until he ran out of road, and then I said, very calmly, that if by quietly he meant without me knowing, then yes, I had absolutely chosen a different path, and if he wanted things to be peaceful moving forward, all he had to do was stop speaking about me like I'm not in the room, and everything else would take care of itself. There was a long pause, and then he muttered something about family being complicated, and I said family is only complicated when people mistake control for care, and then I hung up, not out of anger but out of finality. Because that was the last conversation I needed to have to feel free of whatever hold they thought they had on me, and I didn't cry afterward, didn't shake, didn't second-guess myself. I just sat with the quiet and let it feel like peace instead of punishment for the first time in years. And if they choose to go back to pretending I'm not there, that's fine, because now they know I can see them even when they refuse to see me, and I can speak even when they hope I'll stay quiet, and the next time someone tries to drag my name into a whisper, I'll be standing right there, not to defend myself, but to make sure they understand that from now on, every story they try to tell without me and it ends with me writing the last line.